Okay, so for this particular lecture, you guys are going to need to pull your packet that says 6.1 at the top, Introduction. And we are finally moving into our body system. So I told you at the beginning of the year that we would be covering all 11 systems between semester 1 and semester 2. Up to this point, we've just been doing a lot of our foundation work. We need to talk about those smaller pieces. We need to get a little bit of a feel for the chemistry, how that works into designing our cells and organelles and getting things to move in and around the cells, and then how cells form tissues. And now we're working our way up to the organ and the organ system level. So when we talk about tissues, we had four main types of tissues. We had the connective, epithelial, muscular, and nervous tissue. And we talked about the fact that in order to be considered a tissue, you have to have more than one type of cell that is coming together, working as a unit to carry out a specific job or task within the body. And as we continue to build off of that, every time that we move up a level, we're just changing a couple of words there. So when we go from a tissue to an organ, now we're looking at two or more types of tissue that are coming together to perform a task in order to be able to call that an organ. For an organ system, you have two or more organs that are working together to carry out a job within the body. So that progression is just changing one or two words within the definition from cells to tissues, tissues to organs, organs to organ system, and then all the way up to the full complete organism. So as we get into this particular chapter, this is our integumentary chapter. So the first of the 11 systems that we're going to be talking about, and we're going to be looking at the organs and how they work within that organ system of the integumentary system. So when we talk about the integumentary system, immediately people want to go to the skin, and that is by far the biggest part of the integumentary system. But when we look at the system as a whole, it's much more than that. We're also looking at all of the accessory structures and the small pieces that make up the skin in order to really get a feel for what's going on within this body system. So yes, the skin is a major part of it, but you have your oil glands, your sweat glands, your hair follicles, nerves, blood vessels, a lot of different pieces that are coming together in order to complete this particular system. If you look at the second slide, it talks a little bit about the major things that the integumentary system is going to do for you, and you guys can take a look at that list. You do have different tissues. Obviously, we're talking about an organ, and the skin is actually the largest organ that we have, and it covers, obviously, our entire body. The average person has somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 square feet of skin that is going to take to cover their entire body. So it is a very massive structure. For the average person, it's going to be about 15% of your body weight. So if you think about what you weigh and were to factor that out, 15% of that is going to be just from your skin layer itself. Now, the skin does a pretty big job, and one of the things that it will do is it's going to help maintain homeostasis. So regulating an internal stable balance is very, very important to our ability to survive. And the skin actually helps to do that. And it does it through maintaining our body temperature or helping to maintain our body temperature. When we talk about the skin, it actually works like a blanket. It covers us, it helps hold the heat in, it helps to prevent against big temperature swings if we're out in the elements and it's cold outside. So really working to maintain that overall body temperature and keep us as close to 98.6 as it possibly can. It also creates a barrier between the internal and the external world. So obviously you have everything going on inside the body, but there's a lot that goes on around our bodies as well. And the skin is going to help kind of regulate that. It does it through receptors. So receptors are these tiny little sensors that we have embedded in our bodies. And it's not just in our skin, we do have them in other places, but it makes sense for a lot of them to be in that skin layer because that is the divider between, like I said, the internal and the external world. So by having a lot of those sensors right in the skin, it helps for us to be able to pick up information from our surroundings. If something is approaching and getting close, we have sensors that will pick up on that. If the temperature is really hot or really cold, those sensors in our skin are going to relay that to our nervous system. So then we can make the appropriate choices we need to in order to ensure our survival. So maintaining the homeostasis, that protective covering, maintaining the body temperature, it also does work against preventing water loss. Overwhelming majority of our body is water. And if you guys have ever left a fish tank uncovered, you'll notice after time that the water level starts to drop because that water is evaporating. So same kind of concept with our body. If we did not have a skin layer, our ability to maintain that water level at where it needs to be would be almost impossible. Most people already do not get the amount of water in their systems that they are supposed to. That 64 ounces that we're supposed to hit every day, very few people actually get that in the United States. Overwhelming majority of people would be classified as dehydrated. So if we didn't have that skin layer to hold the water in that we already do have, there would be a lot more people that would be in severe status as far as dehydration goes. Talked about the receptors, the immune system. Again, the skin is our first line of defense against foreign invaders. And so maintaining the health of our skin is very important because as soon as you tear it or scratch it, it breaks open. Now you've created an area where foreign invaders can easily make their way in, and you want to prevent against that. But if damage does occur to the skin and we get an opening through a cut or a scrape, there are immune cells that are right there to respond to it so that hopefully we can prevent any type of infection or illness coming about because of that. The second to last one talks about synthesizing chemicals. And with the chemical issue, one of the biggest things that it's talking about here is our ability to form vitamin D. Vitamin D is very hard to find naturally occurring in foods. Most of the foods that we put into our system do not naturally have vitamin D. The best source is through UV exposure, limited UV exposure. And when you have those UV rays hitting your skin, the chemicals that are present there will actually get converted over into vitamin D, but they need that kind of energy jolt from the UV rays in order to convert them into vitamin D. And vitamin D is very, very important. Number one, it helps with your body's ability to absorb calcium. So a lot of times if somebody is low in calcium, they will get prescribed a calcium supplement, but they'll also get vitamin D with that as well. And that's because doctors know that vitamin D is going to help the uptake of calcium into the body. The other thing that vitamin D does is vitamin D plays a very important part in our mood and how happy we are. Vitamin D is something that is part of your serotonin production. Serotonin is a hormone that controls mood regulation. And if your vitamin D levels are low, serotonin is low, and you tend to be not in a good mood. If vitamin D levels are higher, serotonin production is higher, and that will help people to be in a better mood. So a couple reasons why we need those vitamin D levels to be high within our system. Like I said, the best way to do that is just to get that sun exposure and get those UV rays. And then the last one on the list, it talks about excreting small amounts of waste. Anytime that you sweat, a large majority of that sweat is going to be water loss, but you also are getting rid of salt and you also are getting rid of waste product. And this is the same waste product that would make up your urine. And so you are getting rid of that through your skin. And it just helps helps regulate with the body, like I said, in getting rid of that waste product. A lot of times people will notice that when they secrete that waste product or that sweat, that it will leave a stain behind on clothing, especially white clothing. And that is because that is the same component, that urea, that you would see in your urine when you void that from your system. With the next slide on skin cells, sorry, I already kind of talked about that one, got ahead of myself a little bit, but we didn't talk about keratin. So when you look at your skin and even your fingernails and your toenails, so you have a glue that is produced by your body. It's called keratin, Keratin. And what this keratin does is it actually helps hold your skin cells together. The skin cells that you guys can touch on the outside of your body, those are actually completely dead. And if they were not held together with this keratin or with this glue, they would actually slough off the body in large sheets. If you guys have ever had a sunburn and kind of peeled that skin off, it will come off in large pieces. That's how you guys would lose skin if it wasn't for this keratin. But this keratin is going to glue those cells together, and then they will get sloughed off in very, very small amounts. So they have to kind of get worn and torn and eventually break away from the body. So when you do natural things like pull a coat on and off and it rubs up against your skin, when you towel off after a shower and you use that towel up against your skin, all of those things are going to knock those skin cells off, and they float away into the air and become dust. But that keratin is going to make sure that that happens in a very regulated way so that, like I said, you don't have large flakes of skin falling off all at the same time. Now, I mentioned fingernails and toenails. With your fingernails and toenails, they are hardened surfaces, and that's because in those places, the keratin is kind of amped up a little bit. So you have keratin in your skin holding those cells together, but in those places where you need a little bit more protection, the keratin is produced at a higher level, and that is why you get the hardened surface on your fingernails and your toenails. If you move into the next slide, and I need you to make a change on this one right off the bat, there are only 2 layers of skin. So within the integumentary system, there are 3 overall layers, but 2 of them are only skin layers. So when we talk about the epidermis and the dermis, those are the 2 layers of skin. You also have the subcutaneous layer, which is part of the integumentary system, but it is not considered to be a skin layer. So epidermis is the outermost layer. That is the layer that you guys can touch and see. Underneath that, you have the dermis. So that is kind of sandwiched in between. And then you have the lowest layer, which is the subcutaneous or the hypodermis. So those are the 3 sections that you have. Now, within the slide that you have, or the picture that you have on that particular slide, you have the stratified squamous epithelium. And then you have the dense, irregular connective tissue. And then below that, you have the adipose tissue. So if we go back to what we talked about in our tissue video, I told you guys that when you're trying to distinguish what you should be looking at or what you should be focusing on, is you have to look for the color changes. Now, I realize on yours, this is in black and white. You have your textbooks. Textbooks would be a great resource right now to open up to your integumentary chapter and find these slides and look at them in color. But even without that, looking at it in black and white, you can still distinguish color changes, whether it's a dark gray or a light gray. So that stratified squamous epithelium, that is going to be a darker band. You can see that particular layer of cells. That is going to be the epidermis, the outermost layer. What is identified as the dense irregular, which is going to appear as a little bit lighter gray on your picture, that is the dermis. And then when you get down into the one with the adipose tissue, you'll notice those nice round cells don't really have much going on in them. They look blank or empty. That is into that subcutaneous or that hypodermis layer. So those are the 3 sections of the integumentary system, but only the epidermis and the dermis are classified as skin. So the next slide that we have talks about the epidermis. And with the epidermis, these cells are in the process of dying if they are not already dead. These are the skin cells that are going to eventually be sloughed off over time. And the reason for that is because it's the outer layer of skin, these are the cells that are going to come in contact with things. They are going to become worn and torn and damaged at a much faster rate. So the ability to get rid of those cells is very important because you don't want those damaged cells to be around. So several layers of cells will make up the epidermis. The lower layer of cells, they are close to blood vessels, and so they will still get a little bit of nutrition and oxygen and what they need from those blood vessels. So they're still somewhat living, but as those cells get pushed closer and closer to the surface, the side that you can actually touch, As they get further and further away from those blood vessels, they lose that nutrition, they lose that oxygen, and those cells die. When they die, they start to give up their cytoplasm, and so they deflate and become flat. And by the time they get to the surface, they are completely removed from any blood supply. That's why you can scratch the top layer of your skin and it might turn white, but you don't bleed because there's no blood vessels serving that outermost layer of skin. But those cells will slough off and, like I said, float away into the air and become dust. And you just get that turnover to keep those cells fresh, so to speak. The other cells that we have in here that I haven't talked about, we talked about keratin already. Within your epidermis, you do have layers where the skin is different thicknesses. So in places where you have a lot of contact and a lot of friction, time and time again, so if you think about how much you use your hands to open doors, pick things up, because of how much contact you come into things with your hands, the skin on the palms of your hands is much thicker than most places on your body. Again, soles of your feet, even if you wear shoes, that constant movement in your shoe, or if you walk around barefoot a lot, the skin on your feet is going to become thicker to accommodate that. Other places in your body are going to have very thin skin. So when you think about your lips actually have usually a little bit different skin tone. So they appear more pink or reddish than the rest of your body. And the reason for that is the skin is so thin on your lips that you can actually see the blood vessels coming through. And that's why it has a little bit of a rosier color than the rest of your body, just because of that thin skin. It also allows for you to have a higher sensitivity level within your lips because the nerves are also closer to the surface of the skin because it is so thin. So when we talk about development, one thing that I usually bring up is when you think about little kids, everybody always talks about little kids putting everything in their mouth. Typically, they're not trying to put it in their mouth because they're trying to eat it. They're trying to put it in their mouth because even as little guys, they know that they can feel it really well there. They pick up on that very, very quickly, that they can feel things better at that particular location. So they'll pick things up and they'll touch it to their lips because they're trying to get a better feel for it and a sense for it. Unfortunately, because they don't have the greatest dexterity being little guys, sometimes it ends up in the mouth, but that's not usually the intent. They're just trying to get a sense or a feel for it. We also have cells within the skin that are called melanocytes. Melanocytes produce a pigment called melanin, and with melanin, they are going to, or this pigment is going to be given off again with exposure to UV rays. So when we talk about exposure to UV rays, we know that you want to keep that regulated. So it does a good thing in converting chemicals over to vitamin D. That's a positive. But UV rays also target the DNA in your cells, and it actually causes the DNA to become very excited because it has a high energy associated with it. So the UV rays strike that DNA. DNA becomes very excited and it will actually start to vibrate. The problem with that is that when that DNA starts to get into that high energy state, when it has to replicate itself, it doesn't copy itself over correctly at that higher excited state. And it starts to make more mistakes in that copying or that replication process. So when your cell has to go from being one cell and divide and become two new cells, the problem with that is if that DNA doesn't copy and replicate itself correctly, when it becomes the two new cells, if there's mistakes, then you have a higher chance that something is going to go wrong with that cell, or that it could potentially develop into cancer. So that's why we want to make sure that we regulate the UV exposure as much as we possibly can. Now, what the melanin does is the melanin is going to